I'm going to present tonight sort of like an informal fireside chat. And so I'll present to you this PowerPoint, which is basically just like this very bare bones skeleton of what I'd like to talk about, largely to help me stay on track, but also I think it'll help you all as I'm talking and so forth. So what I do right now for Cooperative Energy Futures, I would kind of split up into three areas. The first area has to do with what I'm doing right now, which is coalition building. We are a member of PSAF and the Energy Democracy Project, Grid Equity Midwest, several national and regional, and then local to Minneapolis or Minnesota groups that are involved in political and regulatory advocacy and other work too. So that's one of my charges, but then more to do with like what I'm going to be speaking on tonight. I am a registered lobbyist at the Minnesota State Capitol, and I lobby on behalf of bills through the energy equity or energy democracy lens as well. And then I do the same thing at Minnesota's Public Utilities Commission and other places, other regulatory arenas, shall we say. Let's go to the first slide, how about? Sorting through solar policy, that was quick. Next slide. And all right, so let's talk. What I'm going to do here first is I'm just going to go through like, I'm going to go through a very 30,000-foot overview, and it's not going to be comprehensive. I don't think it needs to be, of like solar policy and regulation overall. And then more importantly, I think what I'd like to do is to get into like how you all can use it and why you all should care about solar policy and regulation. Advice from me, my personal learnings, things like that, I think will be most useful. And so a couple things before we launch in here. I'm going to be talking in, broad generalizations. So, nothing I say is, necessarily, cut and dry or black and white. This is all kind of, generalizations that I've learned from my years of being in the regulatory and legislative sphere. I also want to apologize beforehand for anyone from a territory. I don't know enough about territories to like give that much, background on policy on territories, but I think all of the like lessons learned and so forth will also apply for anyone that happens to be from a territory. So when I do give my advice, take it for what it's worth. I am a lobbyist, a grassroots lobbyist, one of many different lobbyists at the Capitol. I have about 8 years of experience in this, in both the policy or the legislative and the regulatory realm. And I think that Cooperative Energy Futures punches way above its weight. So I feel like I've done a decent job, but once again, people disagree on things. So let's just dive into like federal policy, federal solar policy, the things that you all would need to know as sort of background. And the first one is the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act, which is commonly referred to as PURPA, developed in 1978. Basically, this is like the federal government's attempt at incentivizing energy innovation before clean energy was really a thing that much, when it was sort of on the horizon. And in like practical terms for all of us, what PURPA means and what it does is it gives you a floor to the price for the electricity that you can put into the grid and get paid for. So the federal government says that every state has to at least pay what's called the avoided cost for energy if a qualifying facility is producing it. So, but the catch to that, the devil's in the details, right? The catch is that every state determines what its avoided cost is. So the PURPA rate is the ceiling or this floor rate that you can get at least if you can get interconnected. And that is, in certain states, a very, very low thing, 2 cents, 1 point something cents per kilowatt hour in some states. Other states, it's higher. But in general, PURPA would be used in a state that doesn't have good solar policy. that exceeds the PERPA rate. So then the other major thing that you all would want to know about is the ITC, the investment tax credit. Of course, I'm sure you all have heard with the new passage of the IRA, we are, at a 30. Oh, I'm sorry. Does someone have a question? No. Okay. With the passage of the new IRA, it's at 30%, the investment tax credit. This is like basically it's like the government paying you back for your investment into solar, your capital costs to solar. And there's also these bonus incentives that I'm sure a lot of you have heard of as well. It can bring up bring down your capital costs, I should say, by 60 to 70%, especially if you're a nonprofit, because you can claim it directly. If you're not a nonprofit, like we are not, we're working on ways of claiming it through PSAF or other orgs like that in partnership. You can also do it through what's called transferability. So there is a whole new market that's stepped up where companies are offering to buy that ITC credit from you if you're not a nonprofit and can't take it directly for a haircut. So, and that market is still like nascent. It's still developing. We don't really know what the standard haircut is yet and so forth. So those like the general federal policy rules. Let's talk about state policy. Next slide, please, Jessica. Thank you. So is it necessary in your state to have policy that enables solar systems? It's not necessary. It really helps. Like I said, PERPA would be there anyway. So you could get that rate, but the PERPA rate, I don't know of any PERPA rate that makes economic sense to build a system. Maybe if you were to get 70-ish% off and you're a nonprofit through the ITC of your capital costs, you might be able to make a PERPA rate of 4 or 5 cents or something like that work, depending on the state. But in general, it really helps to have this solar policy. There are states, you could, in theory, just approach your utility or your co-op, your rural co-op, or whoever provides electricity and work something out. But the incentives for them to do that with you are not great, which is why it's not really a thing that happens on any kind of scale that's, appreciable. So it's not necessary, but it helps. The first major solar policy I'll talk about that's going to, affect all of us, or that really means anything here, is net energy metering. Net energy metering is basically the whole deal where, you put solar on your rooftop or on your site, and then you're producing electricity, and then you are basically getting, you're using that electricity that you're producing through solar panels, but anything extra you put into the grid and get paid for it. That's the energy metering part, the net energy metering part. The net part means in the summer, you're going to produce more than you suck in, because in the panels aren't producing at night. You're not producing energy, so you're sucking in from the grid. But in the summer, generally, and even a lot of times in the fall and spring, you're producing more than you are going to use throughout the whole day. So it's a net positive. There's meters there at your system, that measures that. So net energy metering is, pretty widespread throughout the U.S. There's 34 states plus DC, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands that have some sort of net metering. And there's a great website, DSIRE, USA.org is a good website that the University of North Carolina runs it, and it basically kind of keeps tabs on solar incentives for every state. It's a good place to start for your state. So yeah, net metering can be a legislative thing. It can be like a law, a statute passed. It can be a regulatory decision. It can be voluntary by the utility. They can just choose that. It's not often that they do that, though. All right, community solar. We're still on state, so yeah. Community solar is the other big one. That's what we do a lot of, although we are moving into net energy metering too with low-income residential solar. But community solar is a really popular and, in my opinion, equitable way of doing solar. But only 19 states have it right now, and basically it's a form of virtual net metering. So it's just like having panels on your house, but instead of on your site or your house, it's remotely, there's a larger facility than what you could fit on your house, and it's remote to you, but it's on the same grid, and you're just given credit for a certain amount of that. And because electrons are fungible, once they go into the grid, nobody knows whose electrons are whose, and they're all worth the same. It's very easy, and it's just simply a matter of administrative accounting and a policy that says we're going to allow community solar or net energy metering. So there are other incentives too. Other than that, there are like, renewable energy credits, there are solar production incentives, all these other things too. I won't get too much into them, but I would say like, net metering and community solar are the big ones for right now. Next slide. All right, so just going to give you a quick rundown about legislation versus regulation. State, I think it's pretty obvious. I'm not saying anything new here, but states must pass legislation through their legislatures, and it needs to be signed by the governor to take effect. In general, my experience and certainly in Minnesota, but paying attention nationally, Democrats are generally better, have a better record at passing solar policies than Republicans do. Which is why if you look at the states that have better solar policies, more equitable, more generous, they tend to be bluer states. Doesn't mean red states don't have policies. They do. They just tend to not be as generous. And once again, these are all generalizations. Legislation tends to be more like relationship building and power building, and not quite as technical as regulation. So what I mean by that is like if you are just a lobbyist on clean energy and not a regulatory director as well, like I am, you don't need to quite know as much about the ins and outs, the technicalities of solar and the grid and interconnection and upgrades and all that kind of stuff. It's a little bit more about relationships, power building, making deals. There is some technicality involved in the absolute arcane, rules that most legislatures have. So it really helps to know that. So in that way, it does help to be technical. But in general, you don't need to know as much as, say, if you were in front of the PUC on your issue. And legislation tends to be more of like the policy or the idea or the law's outline versus the details of it. Regulation is more of the details of it. Committee chairs in legislation tend to be really, really important. So, I don't know how all legislatures work, but most of them that I know have committees within both chambers or houses. And the energy and or climate, it'll be called different things in different state committee, is going to be whoever is chairing that in both the House and the Senate is going to be extremely important. They are the people who gatekeep what bills get heard. And if your bill isn't heard, it's pretty hard to get it into what's called conference committee, which is where the House and the Senate have to make their bills the same, the real negotiations, and then obviously pass too. So there are ways to do it if you don't get heard, but you still have to basically have the blessing of the committee chair. So making friends and relationships with committee chairs is really important. And then the other thing is like politics is just, it's crazy, it's wild, it's unpredictable, as I'm sure you all know. The regulatory realm is not quite that way. It's a little more predictable, a little more scheduled, not as hurried. And extraneous factors, exogenous factors don't affect it so much. I'll give you an example. Today, starting Monday morning, I have been in a panic that's kind of subsided right now because all these bills that I'm pushing this session were at jeopardy. And everybody's bills, every single person's bills at the Capitol was in jeopardy because a state senator named Nicole Mitchell, who happens to be on the Energy Committee, coincidentally, was caught, is being charged for first-degree burglary, weirdly.
Girl,
She,
what?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really sad story and a really, I'm just getting the details as of today, by the way, because she's just getting released. But it's just basically this sad story and lapse of judgment too, that her father just died, and her stepmother, who has dementia, and her don't get along, and they live in this house in this resort community in Minnesota that's 3 hours away from where she lives. And she decided Monday morning at 1 a.m. to drive there, showing up at 4 a.m. and break into that house to get her father's ashes and some of his belongings. And the police were called, and she was arrested. She's now being charged with first-degree burglary. She, luckily for us, as because Minnesota has a Democratic trifecta right now, and the Senate, which she is part of, is only a one-seat voting majority. If we lose a seat, we don't have any bills. The Republicans will stop everything that we're doing, and the session is over. So for 2 days, I thought the session was over. But at the same time, taking all my meetings and having to prepare for a session perhaps not being over. And luckily, what seems to have happened, it played out, is like she is not resigning. And the Senate has backed her on this for now, saying we need to see this played out in the court of law and work it out then. So it looks like the session is saved. But this is an example of, like, that doesn't happen in the regulatory realm. Random stuff like that just affecting everybody's priorities. Next slide, please. Regulation, on the other hand, it's generally done by these, what's called either a Public Utilities Commission or a Public Service Commission, or sometimes a utility board of some type. Just depends on where this is. And these tend to be like appointed officials by the people who happen to be in political power at the time. And, they're basically meant, some of the things they do basically are they're meant to like regulate the investor-owned utilities, which are generally monopolies. And in some states, they'll also regulate the rural electric co-ops or the municipal utilities. In Minnesota, they just regulate what I'll call the IOUs, the investor-owned utilities. The rural co-ops are not regulated by our Public Utilities Commission, and neither are the municipals. They regulate themselves. So the Public Utilities Commission has very little say over them, but the IOUs, the investor-owned utilities, or whoever in whatever state they do regulate, they control things like rates, what the electric rates are, interconnection and how it's done, what are called IRPs, which are integrated resource plans, which is what a utility puts out every 3 to 5 years that says what their plan is for the next 10 to 15 years as far as their fuel mix and how they plan to spend their money on infrastructure and everything pretty much. And then IDPs, which stands for Integrated Distribution Plans, which is how they planned to spend money on or manage the distribution grid, not the transmission grid and not the generation part, but just the distribution part. These are all things that are handled at these, I'll call them public utility boards or commissions. I'll just call them PUCs for now, but mind you, they can be called other things. These are all the things that happened at these PUCs. Really significant stuff. The other major thing that happens is almost every law, when it's passed, like I mentioned before, is an outline of an idea or of a bill. The devil is really in the details, and these details get worked out at the Public Utilities Commission. So, I passed a major law last year having to do with reforming our current community solar program. And I have spent the last 3/4 of a year, almost a year, 9 months, and we're still going, figuring out with the PUC the details of that law. And we've had some good decisions and we've had some terrible decisions. And they're really significant decisions. So generally the PUC is more technical. So this is where you need to bone up on your knowledge of solar, and it helps to have others involved in that. And I'll give you tips on some of this later on, but it's just a more technical thing. And just as a side note, like these public utilities commissions / service commissions, utility boards also generally regulate other utilities like gas and telecom. And some states may regulate other things that I'm not aware of. Next slide. So why should you care about policy and regulation when you're, trying to build a solar garden? Well, the lack of solar policies, first of all, or equitable solar policies in your state. If you don't have net metering, if you don't have community solar, or if you have a, not so equitable form of either of those, it really helps to get in there. This is what Cooperative Energy Futures did 7 years ago when I jumped in at the legislature. We were trying to pass these reforms to a program that had gotten stale, that was not equitable, that had no carve out for low to moderate income people, all these issues with it. And it took 6 to 7 years of base building, 6 years because this happened last year, of base building and trying year after year and failing before both the political climate was right and we had built up the base of knowledge amongst legislators and a coalition of people who would no longer oppose it. Although we did have people oppose it, it wasn't enough. So that is one big reason to change the policies to affect your organization to do better within this field, whether equitably, just economically, whatever it is. Also, like on a more, on a more 30,000-foot level, you can affect the overall trajectory of generation and delivery of electricity in your state. These are really high stakes. So, for example, the community solar program reform that I helped pass last session is extremely significant for all solar going forward here in Minnesota, because we created another whole market of solar, which is just this, what they call front of the meter DG, straight to the grid market. So instead of having subscribers on this, garden that's not connected to anyone's house, you just build it up to 10 megawatts, you send it into the grid, and you just set this PPA. You do a power purchase agreement with XL Energy that has yet to be negotiated, of course. That's happening right now at the PUC, by the way. But you set this, you sign this power purchase agreement, and you just sell them electricity, XL. And we created a whole new market of that, which is going to be about, I think it's 10% of sales of all electric sales by 2030. And then on top of that, we reformed the community solar garden market, and community solar is about 65% of all solar in Minnesota. Minnesota is pretty unique in that way, is that we have a ton of community solar, especially for our population base. So, we set the trajectory for 65% of what is solar right now for the foreseeable future in Minnesota. These stakes are really high. Our gardens alone will make about 50% more money than they would before because of the reforms also that we did in this. Like economically, this was a boon to community solar as well. So these stakes are significant. You also, it really helps to know regulators and legislators, because the fate of your program and often of your specific site is in their hands, especially when it comes to regulators. Regulators get up close and personal if you let them, if you're in the room and if you engage. I have had many a regulator reach out to us on specific projects saying, hey, we want to make this work, but we understand you're having problems with this. How can we help? And then I'm directly working with the regulators, and they're doing stuff that otherwise, if I wasn't involved, if CEF wasn't involved in the regulatory realm, showing up at the PUC, showing up with meetings with the Department of Commerce, they would not know about us. They would not care enough about us to ask us these things personally and to get our input on this stuff. So and then legislators also, even in the regulatory realm, have input. Because I have relationships with legislators, oftentimes when there is a contentious issue at the PUC, we will turn to those legislators and say, hey, will you write us a note saying what your intent was on this bill and how it lines up with what we're doing? So when they're making rules, they can say, they can actually refer back to what your intent was and make the rules more in favor of what we want and what you want. And they do that quite a bit. They will step into that realm and say, here's what our intent was when we wrote this. So it really helps to know them materially. Also, there's a ton of federal and state opportunities that have come our way by just virtue of these regulators and legislators knowing about us. And honestly, this is even on a federal level with DOE, Cooperative Energy Futures, I think we've gotten like 5 or 6 now, large federal grants, awards that we've won, competitive ones, and they know about us now. I think that it gives us a leg up when applying for other things, because the people who are reviewing these grants are now familiar with us. They're familiar with our work, our background, our track record, how we do on these things, can we deliver, all these things. So it really helps to be involved in that realm too. I've gone to a bunch of acceptance around the country, a bunch of acceptance speeches slash seminars, conventions for these awards. And I can't tell you how many opportunities have come up with just people coming up to me after that and saying, we love what you do. How can we plug in? How can we help? This kind of thing. The other big thing is coalition building opportunities. I'm going to talk more about this when, when I get to my advice section, but building coalitions is extremely important to success, especially in the grassroots, but in general. Especially though in the grassroots, when you don't have the massive amounts of money to hire the amount of lobbyists. Our main opponent, my professional nemesis, if I could say so, is Xcel Energy, the local utility here. They have 100 full-time lobbyists at our capital. They're the second largest lobbying arm other than Enbridge, which is a pipeline line or a pipeline company, an energy transfer company. They're on the board of everything in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities. They have so much influence. They don't need to build coalitions as much. They still do because they realize the value for it, and they try to co-opt allies. But it is extremely important amongst grassroots to build coalitions. And another reason to care is defense against attacks on solar policy or equitable solar policy. So there are times when the political winds shift, and you may have a net metering, like what happened in California, Arizona, Indiana, other states, net metering policy or a community solar policy that then goes under attack. And it really helps to have strong relationships with legislators and the regulators when that's happening to attempt to defend your policy. And then, finally, just the overall, there's this satisfaction in helping your orgs and others pave the way to a cleaner and more equitable, just and localized energy system, and show people like this can be done, So anyway, sorry, I'm talking the whole time. Sorry, everybody. Anyway, I think we can go to the next slide. What makes equitable solar policy? So I'll just go through this really quickly so y'all have just kind of a taste of what I've both been fighting for and what other people fight for when we're talking about equitable solar policy. Rooftop or small scale programs, these are generally built on site and suck in energy on site, often called behind the meter projects because they are behind the meter and need to be measured how much energy you're pulling in versus pushing out. Those projects, the kind of things you want to have in your state or look for that are good for would be like production incentives for low to moderate income customers. Production incentive meaning, an extra, I don't know, 1 to 3 to 4, whatever they're offering, cent per kilowatt hour incentive for the electricity that you produce and pump into the grid. That is really, really helpful to pencil in projects and make them work economically. Oftentimes when you're dealing with, when you're focused on LMI populations, you have to put more resources, this is what we're finding at least, into this outreach and building trust and hiring people and working with orgs that already have that trust, because oftentimes these populations are used to being predated upon, and rightfully so, they are suspicious. So if you come to them with hey, this is a good deal for you, there's no catch here, there's no money up front, you're going to save money. It doesn't register unless it's coming from a trusted source, or you really work, you sit down, you pay the time, we've hired a Somali speaker, a Spanish speaker, a Hmong speaker, you really have to build those inroads that cost more money. And so this is the justification for having an extra production incentive for LMI. That, and also just the moral or the policy objective of having a just transition where you're, bringing along the LMI population as well. So also there's also development incentives that could be offered for LMI. These are both offered in Minnesota through what's called the Solar Rewards program. So they have like beyond the electricity that you put into the grid and get paid for extra, you also get paid extra per watt to build it. In Minnesota, there's this thing called the Income Qualified Solar Rewards. Great program. We changed it last year to make it even better and more equitable, where there's a larger share of the solar rewards money. Solar rewards money is just like, here's extra money if you have rooftop solar, you know, for the extra or for the electricity you put into the grid. And it's a lottery. It's like a lottery thing. First come, first serve, basically, not so much a lottery. It's a first come, first serve program. And so LMI, what they were doing is before they saved like 20% for LMI, 80% of the money was for anyone. And then after September 1st of each year, if you didn't reach that 20%, or if that 20% didn't get used, the rest of the population that's not income qualified can dig into that 20%. We changed it last year, so half of it is LMI. Half of all the money now in solar rewards is LMI. They can't delve into it. Not only can they not delve into it, but meaning that, like, you know, if the LMI population or the LMI portion is not used up by the end of the year, the other, you know, non-LMI residents can't use that. It gets rolled over into the next year, so it can just build up and build up. And the other big thing we did in Minnesota with the Solar Rewards Income Qualified Program for rooftop solar is that we advocated for increasing that upfront development incentive. So now it's something like $3 or $3.25, I can't remember exactly, per watt, which to build a system like that is like $3.50 a watt. So you're paying like 90% of the system upfront through this solar rewards thing. And we have this new thing where we're going to pay the rest of it if you're part of the co-op, and you'll get the energy burden. But that's a program we're kind of doing through CEF. But you know, that in general, to have 90% of your system paid off is going to help all LMI, even if you're not involved in our program or anyone else's program. So those are some of the kind of the things to look out for as what's good, what's equitable in you know, rooftop, what they'll call rooftop or behind the meter small scale programs. So, oh, sorry. I'm getting policy calls right now. Community solar programs, what's equitable in that? And this is like a large part of what I'm going to say is what we did this last session in 2023 to make our program more equitable. And that was like, we increased the amount of money that you get paid for the electricity that you get. And what you generally want to be doing is you want that money, or you want that amount that you get for the electricity you put into the grid, you want it to equal or be at parity with what's called the retail rate, which is which all that is what you would have to pay to the utility. You want that parity. You want it matching that, because that means when there's rate hikes, you get paid more too for the electricity. And it actually matches what you're paying for the retail rate, which guarantees you energy burden relief. If it's not attached to the retail rate, then what happens is, even if you start up here, and if there's not a good escalation policy, at any given point, the retail rate based on rate hikes could go over that. And all of a sudden, you're not really receiving the kind of energy burden relief that you should be receiving. So a good rule of thumb is that you want it to be at the retail rate, whatever rate you are being credited for the electricity you're putting into the system. And if you can get over the retail rate, do it. That's the way to go. LMI carve out. This is something we did here too. Minnesota, now we have a 30% LMI carve out. Other states have a 50% LMI carve out. You know, politically, we couldn't push it past 30, but we were pretty happy we got 50 as it is. So, you know, a carve out is just simply like, this amount of the program needs to be for LMI customers. And then the administrator would make sure that happens. Consumer protections, we added a bunch of them because there are a lot of fly-by-night, unscrupulous community solar developers and solar developers in general, and they give us a bad name. And honestly, our opponents use that against us at the Capitol. So we did a bunch of consumer protections to make sure people actually save money. You can't rip people off. To make sure you can't charge if people want to get out of your garden. To make sure, you know, things like you all terms have to be very, very, like clearly stated and so forth. There's a bunch of other ones, but these are consumer friendly protections. LMI bill credit incentives. So like, you could also, we didn't do this actually we did do this in our Minnesota one. We just did it in a different way. So you could not only could you have a carve out for your LMI population within the community solar program, you could also say they get paid more. So anyone in that LMI population, and in our case, the 30%, they actually make a lot more money for the electricity they put in than the rest of the population. That's another thing that, in my opinion, would be an equitable change to the community solar program if it's not already being done. And then lastly, you could create a public benefit or a general service incentive, meaning like one type of customer that you could give more money for, and or say like you have to, LMI, sorry, is low to moderate income. Please stop me when I say acronyms. I'm so used to using them. So anyway, the public, you can make another type of subscriber that basically says like, this has to be a public benefit subscriber, meaning like a state institution, a public school district, a low-income housing provider, something like that. You can define it how you want. So so basically those are the main things that I see as like equitable issues in community solar. Next slide. So utilities, let's talk a little bit about utilities. And I know there will be different opinions on this. I'm trying to gauge myself. Jessica, how long do I have here to finish this up?
We have about like 5 more minutes so that we can have the fellows go into breakout sessions and then ask you questions.
All right, I've been going way too slow. Let's speed it up a little bit then. All right, utilities. There's going to be different opinions on this. I think it's important to understand where the utility motivation comes from. And I'm going to mostly talk about IOUs right now, investor-owned utilities. These are these large monopolies that are owned by, shareholders that are required to make a profit for their shareholders and have this regulatory compact with the state that says you're regulated by us, but you get a guaranteed rate of return, a guaranteed profit. They are motivated to make a profit for their shareholders. In fact, they can be sued if they don't do their fiduciary duty of making as much profit as possible to their shareholders. Meaning if there are activist shareholders that don't think that the utility is pushing hard enough to make a profit, they can sue them. And it happens. So this is where their motivation comes from. It is not, in my opinion, an energy transition or equity within it, even though they may talk about all this stuff. In my opinion, they're very much interested in saving stranded assets or I should say, making them not stranded assets, meaning gas plants, coal plants, all these things. Whatever they can save and use for as much of that life as possible, they will do. That's my opinion on it. Should you work with them? Maybe. In some certain circumstances. I'm working with the utility right now in an interconnection bill because our interconnection system is so messed up right now in Minnesota that it's even making them look bad. They were fighting us on all kinds of interconnection reform until it started making them look bad. Now I work with them. Now, when I say they're my professional nemesis, I'm very friendly with them. I work with the two top lobbyists. We're very friendly. It is a good idea to stay friendly at all times and in the policy realm, but know who your real friends are, in my opinion. Are there lines that shouldn't be crossed? Yeah. Don't let them, in my opinion, and this has been tried a bunch of times, don't let them pit you against the rest of the solar developers, including ones that don't necessarily care about equity. Because in my opinion, the real divide here is between smaller, less concentrated, and less resourced companies that are looking to have non-concentrated distributed generation versus very well-resourced companies that want to concentrate wealth and also want to do concentrated generation, meaning utility scale stuff that they can own. That's how they want the transition to work. So we have been coaxed several times into and offered many things to side with Excel on certain things against developers. Because of long-term strategic analysis, we choose not to do that. Now, that being said, some political environments are more hostile and you may need to do more compromise. Next slide. Advice. All right, I'm going to go through these really quick. Be in the room. You got to be there. If you're not, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. This is generally true. You got to show up at the table. Build coalitions is the other huge thing. It has been so beneficial for me to build coalitions with people. You can't take on this work by yourself. Utilities have a team of lobbyists and a team of lawyers, like a whole staff full of them. They will drown you in work. Choose your champions and cultivate them. Legislators especially. Choose them early on. Get your progressive ones, educate them, back them up, have them back you up. Keep the relationship going with them because it's not going to probably pass in 1 year, whatever you're doing. It'll probably take multiple years. Engage with groups that you disagree with. I've had a lot of this and a lot of like debate about this. And what I've found works the best is when you don't agree on something with a group, if they seem to be undermining, you just engage on other stuff. And after a while, trust starts to build. And then they tend to, and I've seen this happen, step out of the particular argument that you were originally, disagreed upon. They tend to take a sideline. Doesn't always happen, but that's my experience. Don't be discouraged by your defeats. I think I've said that. This is a multi-year thing. And also in the future, organize for the legislators you want. So like, really try to push the most progressive legislators and, get them elected, because that's really the way to go about it. One last slide. We'll try to do this one really quick. Once again, be in the room for regulation as well. Lean on your coalition to learn your subject matter. This is really difficult stuff. A lot of it is very technical. I lean on a bunch of engineers from nonprofits that I know, from IREC, the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, and from the Grid Lab, and from NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab, from Lawrence Berkeley Lab, all relationships I've built with. They're willing to work with me. They give me answers on stuff. It's the only way I know about any of this stuff. Pay attention to all kinds of dockets, not just in your little area and regulations, so other subjects. Build relationships with commissioners. They're just people like us. And after a while, they start to trust you more when they just know you. And also other regulators like Department of Commerce or whoever does the regulation in your thing. I think that's it. Go to the next one. I think it's just an example, which I don't have time for. Yeah. Okay. We can end here.